right, good morning. How is everybody today? Kind of a dreary day out there. So today we're going to start talking about global market. We'll finish that and maybe move into some on marketing research. So it's going to be a busy couple days because next week is the second exam. So you'll have a week to complete that. So we're going to probably go through this fairly quickly. If you have questions, please feel free to stop me and say you need more explanation or whatever. We largely operate in a global market in the contemporary era. If you went back in time to when I was a child, you might have said, well, not very much is engaged in globalization, although you would have been wrong, but there would have been certainly less involved in globalization than there is today. Almost everything that we consume has some kind of global aspect to it. Oil, for example, floats on a global market, which is why even if we produce more, if the demand globally goes up, the price of oil will go up, and we will experience inflationary pressure as a result of that kind of activity. So as the world becomes more and more industrialized or post-industrialized, and we have more and more demand on oil, obviously the price is going to be dependent on that economic activity. If we have a recession or something like that, obviously that will impact the demand for oil. And we'll talk about, demand pull and cost push kinds of inflation and things like that. And so the global market is becoming enormously important as we think about what it is that we're doing as marketers. There's over $25 trillion a year, and that's at a conservative estimate in global trade. 75% of this is in tangible goods and commodities, things that we can touch, taste, see, and feel, and 25% is in services. Now, in the United States, 25% of our economic production is in tangible products that we produce, and 75% is in actual services. So the amount of economic impact in this country that we produce is largely intellectual services and not tangible products, right? We are a post-industrial economy, but the rest of the world is still largely an industrial economy, and so tangible goods and services are obviously, or tangible goods and products are obviously enormously important. China is the leading exporter, followed by Germany and the United States, and the US is the leading importer, followed by China and Germany. When we talk about global trade, we look at things like GDP, gross domestic product, which is the monetary value of a nation's goods and services. And the US is the largest, which is why we're also the reserve currency for the world. Will we always be the reserve currency for the world? I don't know. Probably not. There will be other, economies that may overtake us, and they may become the world's reserve currency. But right now, the US is the largest, which is why everything that's done mostly is traded in US dollars. Nobody wants, the Kenya currency, right? For example, when we sell goods and services to Kenya or to Mexico, nobody really wants the Mexican peso. They want US dollars. So the balance of trade. If you import more than you export, you have a deficit, which the United States has. And if you export more than you import, you have a surplus. Now, generally speaking, we think of having a deficit as a bad thing, right? But that's not necessarily true. It can be a reflection of the state of development. It's not unusual that China would be exporting a lot of stuff, tangible stuff, that is, into the United States, imported into the United States, because we no longer produce. If you went back in time to the early part of the 20th century, we produced a lot of the stuff that we wore, for example, the textiles. We no longer do that. Almost all of the things that you wear are produced somewhere else. Why? Because it is more efficient and cheaper to produce them in other countries than it is in the United States. Now, since I'm an ethicist, we should think about the ethical implications of that. Why is it cheaper to produce it in other parts of the world? Well, because in developing nations, they don't have the labor laws and restrictions that we have in the United States. So, for example, child labor laws are greatly relaxed in other parts of the world. And economists will argue that that's just part of development. As those places develop, they will get the protections that we enjoy in the United States, but that part of the development process is going through that, where you have labor that is less than fairly represented with regard to the power structure between the company that employs them and the laborer. And we went through this in the United States, right? We went through a period of time when, in the early part of the Industrial Revolution, at the beginning of the 20th century, where we had children working in factories in the United States. That was not atypical. So what gives one nation a competitive advantage? Well, Porter's Diamond and National Competitive Advantage says there are a number of things that allow a country to become a competitive or gain a competitive advantage. Why is, for example, the United States an economic powerhouse? Why are we the largest gross domestic product in the world? Well, there are factor conditions, the ability to convert natural resources to a competitive advantage. Now, none of these is dispositive, because you can look at, if we went back in time to the beginning of the 20th century, if you looked at some of these things that we say are what you need to have a national competitive, many of the nations of South America, for example, Brazil and Argentina, had these kinds of same factors. So why is it that the US rose and those economies didn't necessarily? Again, if we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, Brazil and Argentina have similar factors. They have lots of natural resources that they could convert to a competitive advantage. They're big countries. They have lots of economic and natural resources. Why is it that the United States grew and they didn't? Well, demand conditions. The number and sophistication of domestic consumers is important. Having a strong middle class. So one of the things that the United States did is, as a result of muckraking journalism, partly as a result of muckraking journalism, you had people that became concerned about child labor and labor conditions in the United States. And maybe you didn't have that in some other places. That led to a growth of the middle class. If you educate people and you get them to read and write and understand their future through education, you build a middle class. And if you build a middle class, you have a sophisticated consumer base. The related and supporting industries. Now, again, if we look at South America, a lot of the countries, Brazil and Argentina, had these sort of synergies between suppliers and producers that we have in the United States. What is it that made the United States competitive according to this kind of analysis? Well, for example, during the early part of the Industrial Revolution, and we talked about the Ford Model T and the Ford Motor Company, well, we had lots of steel in the United States. What are cars historically made out of? They're not anymore for the most part. But at that point in time, they were made out of steel. So you had steel producers who were producing steel, and this guy who was producing automobiles that were allowing for the transportation of mass numbers of people. And that's a synergy, right, between those two. We weren't having to import that in order to develop that technology. The company strategy, rivalry between companies and structure, the national regulatory environment, and the competitiveness of the environment. So is the environment allow for competition and growth? If you have multiple companies that enter the market and you have a freer market that is not necessarily constrained, you in theory will get better products, right? Again, if we went back to the beginning of the 20th century, lots of countries, Mexico is another one, that it's a big country, it has lots of natural resources, should have been on par with the United States to advance. Why is it? Well, none of these is dispositive, but if you put them all together and look at them, why did the United States? Well, we had sort of a political climate that encouraged this kind of growth and development through organizing of labor and the education movement, things like that, that allowed us to have a more sophisticated consumer base. Over the last 100 years, what we saw is initially lots of countries were very protected. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, of their own industries. So they favored their own industries over those of other countries. Now we've seen a decline in protectionism, but this is changing. As a result of changes in administrations in various nations, we might see, so historically, over the last 100 years, we've seen a decline in tariffs. We may see an increase in tariffs, right? As the new administration takes over and negotiates with various trading partners. So we've generally seen a decline, but we're now seeing countries talking about tariffs, which are taxes on imports. You can also have a quota, which is a restriction on products that are allowed into the United States. So for example, historically, the US has supported its sugar manufacturers, and they've had an import quota on sugar, which has cost consumers in the United States about $3 billion a year. Why would we do that? Agricultural protectionism has historically been important in the United States. We declined in protectionism in some areas, and because there are lobbyists that have good access to government, they have managed to get protection for certain industries and things like that. And the agricultural industry is one of those. The ag sector is one of those that has been particularly successful in the United States. We have formal integration with the WTO, 135 member countries. 90% of global trade is covered under the WTO, and it encourages free trade among the members. Now, what we saw is during the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, there was a greater integration of global markets. For example, you had the European Union come about and became a significant trading partner, but we are seeing some, again, we were seeing a decline in protectionism. Now we're seeing sort of an increase maybe and it's a question mark because of things like Brexit, the United Kingdom exiting the European Union. They were never fully integrated into the European Union the way other countries were. When I was a foreign exchange student in Germany in the early 1990s, Germany had its own currency, for example. It was called the Deutschmark. And West Germany. So there were two Germanys. There was an East Germany and a West Germany, and West Germany had their own currency. Italy had its own currency. It was called the lira. France had its own currency. It was called the franc. And all of these countries, and so if you traveled at that point in time when I was a foreign exchange student, and I traveled on the train across countries and stuff like that, you had to do a number of things. At every border, you had to go through customs every time you crossed. And what we're talking about in Western Europe would be similar to this last weekend. I flew a plane down to my brother in Texas, right? Texas is bigger than lots of countries in Europe. So think about if you had to cross the border at Texas and they had border guards and you had to go through customs. That's what it was like when I was a foreign exchange student in the early 90s in Western Europe. So Germany had its own currency. France had its own currency. Every time you went from Germany to France or France to Spain or Germany to Italy or Switzerland, you had to go through customs. And you would have to stop at the passport office and they would ask you if you had anything to declare, and you would get a stamp in your passport. I have all of my old passports, by the way, and like the first one that I had has lots of stamps in it. They don't do that anymore. They just scan it through a barcode reader now, And once you enter the European Union, so if you'd gone before Brexit to London, you could enter the European Union and not have to go through customs and passport control again. Now, as a result of the fact that England has exited the European Union, you have to go through that again. Now, they never fully integrated in that Germany lost their mark, Italy lost the lira, France lost the franc, and they went to a common currency called the euro, right? Britain never did that. They never gave up the pound sterling. And so they always had their own currency, but they were, in other respects, largely formally integrated into the European Union. Now, what they did is they exited the European Union. And so we are seeing somewhat of an increase in protectionism. What does that mean? Well, if you fly to Great Britain and London first on your European vacation, you will go through customs and border at the point of entry, which will be, for most of you, if you fly over there, London, Heathrow. And then when you go to Europe, you'll have to go through it again. People in the European Union, as a result of that integration, can move freely among countries. And so you had lots of people that moved, for example, to the United Kingdom or from the United Kingdom to the continent to work. And they could do that fairly easily. Now, as a result of the exit of the United Kingdom, when they did that, it's harder to work from the United Kingdom to France and things like that. So we're seeing somewhat of a disintegration of the globalization in terms of barriers to entry. There's also, we no longer call it NAFTA. I don't know what it's called as a result of the first Trump administration's renegotiating the deal with Mexico and Canada. It was basically NAFTA 2.0 kind of, and we'll see what happens with that. There's also the Asia Free Trade Agreement. So you have these free trade agreements in various parts of the world, and there was, until recently, a movement towards more and more economic integration and reduction of barriers to entry. Reduction of taxes and tariffs and things like that. So global competition, most firms now operate on a worldwide economic plane. So you have global companies. There are various ways that you can do this. You can have international or various types of global companies. International firms, they are firms that engage in trade in different countries with marketing similar to their home country. So they sell products that are similar across their home country and other countries in a very similar way. What's an example of that? Well, Avon, for example, markets in a very similar way. They sell very similar products across Europe, South America, Asia. You can have a multinational firm which views the world as consisting of unique parts and markets to each of those differently. So, for example, automobile manufacturers in the United States operate and they produce cars and vehicles that are different. We're one of the few countries where people drive huge urban assault vehicles like Cadillac Escalades. You don't find those in Europe. Why? If you've been to Europe, the town that I lived in as a foreign exchange student it was a medieval town. It had a wall around it, and the inner part of the city, which was still very prominent, had tiny little streets. You are not going to get a Cadillac Escalade down those streets easily. You're not going to park easily. And so cars in Europe tend to be smaller, more compact. People have Fiats. Now, they've tried to import those. They've done this recently in the last 20 years, they started re-importing Fiats, which are kind of a horrible car, in my opinion, to the United States. And people, sort of got interested in driving these smaller cars. And that was as a result of largely gas prices going up. But the minute that we adjusted to the price of gasoline, and the minute that we saw a decrease in gasoline prices, what happened to the interest in those small cars? It went away. Americans like large cars. So the way Ford markets and the products that they sell historically, what's the number one selling Ford product in the United States? The Ford F-150. That's not what they sell in Europe. In fact, at one point in time, Ford was going to get rid of their automobile market and go exclusively to SUVs, trucks, with one exception, and that was the Ford Mustang. Now they have pulled back on that. But Americans like big cars. Why? Because we think we need to haul all of this stuff all over the planet with us, right? So unique parts, and they market differently to each of those parts. In Europe, cars are smaller. Transnational firms view the world as one market, and they standardize where they can, because they view that there are similarities among people. There is a growing global middle class that have similar needs and wants. Global consumers are popping up, and this sort of growing middle class is emerging, and they have obviously similar needs in terms of travels and desires and things like that. But we still see a lot of unique aspects to culture, right? So that becomes important when we talk about the global environmental scan. Culture plays a big part in how we go about integrating into a global market. The values and preferred modes of doing business that countries expect. So, for example, the example I give here is in India, McDonald's doesn't sell hamburgers with bovine product in it, right? They use other products, mostly I think it's chicken products in India. In Japan, the customs are different. So when KFC decided to go into Japan, what is a typical American experience at a fast food chain like Kentucky Fried Chicken or McDonald's? You order your food and they sort of toss it to you in a bag, and it's a very fast and efficient transaction. In Japan, the custom was that, like, you look the customer in the eye, you fold the bag over a certain way, and you hand it to them with both hands. And so when KFC started doing business in Japan, they had to take awareness of the fact that the way you serve people in the United States is radically different. They also had to go, as part of the sort of culture, when they went into these various areas, it was customary in Japan to go and ask people in the area if they would give you their sort of permission to do business in that area. That is completely antithetical to the American way of doing business, isn't it? How do Americans do business? We just decide we're going to open a business, and we don't care whether or not the community or the neighbors want it. Did most small towns, for example, want, and you all are too young to remember this, but I remember when Walmart came to small town America, like Guthrie, America. Guthrie used to have a downtown that had dress shops and men's clothing stores and shoe stores and a Radio Shack and all of these things, these small retailers that served the local community. Walmart came in, and what happened to the shoe store and the dress store and the men's clothing store? All of those went out. If you go to downtown Guthrie today, the kinds of shops that you will find, as opposed to in the late 1980s and early 1990s when we moved to Guthrie, where you had traditional retailers. Now what you have in downtown Guthrie are antique stores and specialty kinds of retail shops that are focused on unique goods and services rather than stuff that you can get at Walmart, right? Because Walmart put all of those kinds of small mom and pop shops out of business. So in Japan, you go and you ask your competitors if you can do business in the area. That is not the American way of doing things, right? We just go in and open our business and don't think a lot about it. Now, I mean, that's somewhat of an oversimplification because we do have zoning, but if you want to put in a business in downtown Edmond, which is zone commercial, and open up a store, you don't go around and ask the other retailers in the area, do you mind if I do this, right? So language becomes important as well as part of culture. When you're doing advertising, you want to translate and then back translate. So you use a second interpreter to translate back into the original language to make sure that the meaning that you are wanting to convey is the meaning that you are in fact using, right? So you use two interpreters to do this, and also thinking about culture and customs. Even if you get the message right, even if you get it translated and then back translated, maybe that message doesn't go over. And so when I was in my doctoral program, one of the other students that was in the program with me, almost all business PhDs were a little different than other PhDs in that most of us have industry experience. That's very unusual in things like political science or sociology to have somebody who has experience. Generally speaking, in those fields, what you do is you get a bachelor's degree, you decide that you want to be an academic, and you go directly from the bachelor's into a PhD program. And after you complete your comps and you defend your proposal, they will award you a master's degree, usually an MA or an MS. That's not the way it works in business. Most of the time in business, what you find is you find students that have gone out into industry, they've worked in industry for a while, they get their MBA, and then they decide that they want to do research and they want to be an academic. And so they have a tendency to go back. And so all of the people in my doctoral program, with the exception of one, who was a student who'd gone straight through, had industry experience. And her industry experience was she had sold helicopters for Sikorsky helicopters. So and this was fascinating to me because I'm a pilot. I have a commercial pilot's license. So I talked to her a lot. And one of the things, she was Hispanic. And so she sold to the South American market. One of the things that they did in their advertising campaign in the United States is they marketed as a tool for people who are in a hurry and on the go and need to get where they need to be in a timely fashion. That was antithetical to sort of the culture of South America, because the culture that they were marketing to in South America doesn't focus on the need to be on the go and in a hurry all the time, right? You're going to have to find other benefits that the helicopter offers other than for those people that are in a hurry and on the go, because that was not, even though they did the translation into Spanish and into Portuguese for the Brazilians, that's just sort of antithetical to the way they perceive the way business should be done. Economic considerations that you have to think about when you go into another country. The stages of development. Is it a developed country like Western Europe? Are you selling to people that are similar to your own home country? Or is it a developing? 86% of the world is still classified as developing. Now, this has changed. When I was in political science as a young political scientist, and I went through political economics and things like that, we talked about first world, second world, third world countries. We no longer talk about that. We talk about developed and developing countries. So 86% of the world is still in the developing world. What does that mean? They're industrializing, or they're becoming newly industrialized countries mix. So what is the economic infrastructure that they have in these places that's going to allow you to do business? What's the communication like, the transportation, and the financial services and distribution available? What kind of consumer income and purchasing power do they have? When McDonald's first went into Russia, what do we think of as McDonald's in the United States? Well, McDonald's is fast, cheap, and consistent. Although I would question whether it's cheap anymore, because a value meal at McDonald's is now $15 for, if you get the super size. I guess they don't do super size, but if you get the large size anymore, it's $12 to $15 depending on what you get. So I'm not sure that, although that's less than what you would pay at a casual dining restaurant, I'm not sure that it's all that cheap. I guess it's relative. But when they went into Russia, because they had been so depressed as a result of the communist regime in Russia, it was a really expensive and sort of unique experience for most Russians. McDonald's was a big deal. Whereas in the United States, it was viewed as like sort of, the bottom of the barrel. Why is it that you go to McDonald's? Well, if you're traveling across country, for most of you, if you go to McDonald's, it's not because it's your favorite place, although I genuinely think that McDonald's does have the best French fries. However, they're not nearly as good as they used to be in the 1980s. Do you want to know why the fries are not as good as they were in the 1980s?
Beef tallow.
Huh?
Beef tallow.
That's exactly it. Yes, that's correct. They used to put beef tallow in the frying oil, which affected the taste of the French fry. And so it was more sort of savory than it is now. But in spite of the fact that they took that out, because that was a vegetarian option, if you fry your fries in beef tallow, it's no longer vegetarian, right? But as the vegetarian movement took off, what could you get at McDonald's if you were a vegetarian? French fries, right? Because it's not got, or in theory, it doesn't have any animal product in it, but it did have beef tallow, so they stopped frying their fries in beef tallow, and they started using pure vegetable oil to fry their fries. And I still think that they're by far, if they're fresh, some of the best French fries on the planet. But other than the French fries, is McDonald's like the first choice of most people? No. Why do you stop at McDonald's? It's cheap, it's fast, it's consistent, right? The Big Mac is going to taste like a Big Mac in Oklahoma City and in New York City if you go to a McDonald's there, right? What is a Big Mac? 2 all-beef patty, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. And it's going to be that way in Germany. I can tell you, as a foreign exchange student who had a family that cooked horrible food, the Germans, I don't think, should be noted for they're not French. And every time, there was no McDonald's in the little town that we lived in. So every time we'd go to Frankfurt, I would run, not walk, run to McDonald's to get, and I would sit there and eat like 4 or 5 Big Macs, because it was like the most delicious thing on the planet if you don't have it. But if you have access to it all the time, it's just McDonald's, right? It's not something that we're looking forward to. Whereas in Russia, as a result of the fact that when they were first coming out of the communist rule and communist regime, the economics of the country were very, very low. And so McDonald's was actually viewed as an exclusive sort of kind of restaurant. Currency exchange rates become important in thinking about global economies. The political and regulatory climate and the political stability. When Russia first opened up to Western development, and then the fall of the Soviet Union occurred, lots of Western firms flooded into Russia. When Soviet communism completely collapsed, there was a view that the West had won, our open sort of democratic values had prevailed, and that this was going to be an economic boom. And lots of people did move into Russia, and they did very, very well initially. But as the political climate and political stability has changed, those views have also changed. What happened in Cuba, for example, during the Cold War, you had before the Castro regime, you had the Batista regime, which was very pro-American, very pro-Western. And then the Castro regime came in, they turned towards communism, and they nationalized all of these businesses that had American investors in them, right? So you have to think about the political stability of the country that you are going to go into and try to do business in. Now, Cuba has become more open to U.S. development in recent years. But for most of my childhood growing up, for example, you couldn't go to Cuba. It was prohibited for Americans to go unless you were one of a very few exceptions that would allow you to go there. Trade regulations that you have to consider in terms of the business. So, for example, if you are McDonald's in most of Western Europe, what's one of the biggest things that McDonald's sells? Happy Meals. And why is it that kids love to go to McDonald's? When I was a kid, I loved to go to McDonald's because you got a toy in the Happy Meal. They prohibit that kind of marketing to children in many countries. So you have to think about that. If you are a pharmaceutical company, you cannot engage in direct consumer advertising in most of the world. There's only one other nation that allows D2C advertising of pharmaceutical products, and that's New Zealand. So in the United States, we allow pharmaceutical companies to advertise directly to you, which means that lots of people engage in self-prescription, right? They're going to their doctors and demanding that the doctor prescribe certain products if they think that they have these conditions. You can't do that in the rest of the world. So how do you have to market if you're a pharmaceutical company in those countries like England, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, right? Those people need drugs the same way we do, but how do you go about marketing it? You don't market it through television. What has become one of the big drugs that is popular now? Diabetics all across the country have run in and asked their doctors to prescribe Ozempic or Wegovy or things like that. And now it's not just diabetics, it's other people that are running in and asking their doctors to prescribe these because it appears that Ozempic, which is semaglutide, and Wegovy are effective in appetite suppressant and weight loss and weight control, right? So you have people that are running in. Can't do that in the other countries. So how do you actually have to market to them? The old-fashioned way, the way drug companies did market before they started doing direct consumer advertising heavily in the United States, you had to market to doctors who are the ones that are going to prescribe the drugs that people need. You have to go through pharmaceutical reps and market to those doctors. So the entry strategies. Exporting is the easiest. You just basically send your product across borders, right? This is prominent among small and mid-sized firms. You just export what it is that you already make. There are two ways you can do it. You can do it indirectly, where you use an intermediary. And lots of countries, again, this goes to the political and economic climate of the country. Lots of countries will not allow you to just directly import or export. You have to use a local business in order to do that. You can't just do it yourself. So the use of an intermediary in a host country is very typical. You can do it directly without intermediaries. What are some examples of that? Boeing sells airplanes, for example, to France and to other countries. My sister was in charge, that was her area, was to sell aircraft to various governments that were using Boeing products in their defense departments. So that's without intermediaries, but lots of things, particularly consumer products. What makes Boeing unique in the ability to sell planes in other nations without an intermediary? Well, it's the competitive environment. How many people produce military aircraft? There's almost none. There's like 3 firms that do this in the world today, right? Boeing is one of them. Now they do have competitors in the civilian market, right? The Airbus manufactures stuff, but in defense, Boeing is in many respects the only competitor, which allows them to do this directly without having, or they're one of, a couple of firms that will do this without having intermediaries. But most small firms and mid-sized firms are going to be required probably to use an indirect and an intermediary. Licensing is another low risk and capital free, in some instances, way of engaging in global trade. So you license your product across countries. This is very typical with service firms. So the United States exports a lot of kind of fitness. We are fitness crazy in the US. So we've developed all kinds of things like Jazzercise. One of my colleagues, his wife has a Jazzercise franchise, and they license that in other countries as well, I believe. Joint ventures in which 2 companies share ownership and control. You'll see this, for example, among automobile manufacturers. You will find joint ventures. My brother had I believe it was a Mazda pickup, and the Mazda pickup that he had was exactly the same as the Ford Ranger. They were that product line was a joint venture between Ford and Mazda. And so you have 2 companies that share ownership and control. You can have direct investment. This is the most risk, but also has the highest potential rewards, where you directly go in and start a business in another country. And it's the most risky, but obviously, if you are doing licensing or joint ventures or exporting, you're going to share those profits with the people in that country. So how do you create a international marketing program? Well, there are various strategies. One is to have a product strategy, which is where you sell the same product in another country. And the classic example of this is Coca-Cola. During the Carter administration, something like 5 of Carter's cabinet level officers, secretaries, had been executives at Coca-Cola. Secretary of State Vance, I think, had been on the board of directors of Coca-Cola. Attorney General Bell had been general counsel for Coca-Cola. Richard Nixon opened up China to American development in 1972. And what was the first product we exported to communist China? This was called the Coca-Cola Connection in the Carter administration's cabinet. And the first product we exported to communist China was Coca-Cola. You can find Coca-Cola across the world now. It's the same product. And again, Coca-Cola, like McDonald's, and I can tell you, having traveled, it's the same in all these other countries, right? They have strict quality control. It's the same product. It's just like, with the exception of India, a Big Mac is 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. You can adapt your products to the country that you are selling. I think I talked about this before. Bread in the United States has, since we've developed the loaf and slice bread model, that's the kind of bread that we're used to in the US. Now, we are in some ways, as a result of things like Whole Foods and other sort of, artisan friendly companies, we are developing consumption habits of different types of bread. But historically, beginning in the Industrial Revolution and the 1950s and 60s, bread in the United States has come in a sort of rectangular loaf that's pre-sliced, and so Tupperware made, I talked about this before, a bread saving product that was really, really popular when they wanted to ship it out to other parts of the country or other parts of the world. They had to make it round, because like in India, they have traditional round sort of loaves, because the way you bake bread in a lot of other countries is in ovens where you put it in a round loaf, because that's the way it sort of comes. If you don't have a container like a glass or mold to put it in, it's in round loaves. So you can do product invention, creating a new product for a country, creating new products so creating various flavors and things like that other countries would like. For example, Ben and Jerry's ice cream does that. Promotional strategies, using your environmental scan becomes important. So scanning the environment, and then also distribution strategies that you have to think about when you enter. So for example, I use Coca-Cola. When they entered into India and they started selling in India, how is Coca-Cola distributed in the United States? Well, if you go by any sort of convenience store or large box retailer, you're going to find Coca-Cola being distributed by large semi-tractor trailer trucks, right? They pull up and they deliver cases and cases. In India, when Coca-Cola first went in, they didn't have, again, large tractor trailer trucks. You find this in Western Europe as well. The delivery methods are going to be by truck, but the trucks that deliver stuff in Western Europe, in many respects, into inner city areas, are much smaller than the trucks that we use in the United States to deliver things, because you've just got an infrastructure that is much more compact. So in India, they use tricycles, literally to deliver product to small vendors in inner city areas. These motorized trikes. Any questions about globalization, global markets? I know it's a lot to cover. Marketing research. This is the part that most students dislike. How many of you have had the business research class? None of you have had business research? No? Statistics, business stat? Okay, one. All right. So this is the part that students really, really dislike the most, because it involves math. There will not be anything that you have to calculate on the exam, so I won't ask you to calculate a regression line or something like that. But it is the quant part of the course. So again, at the beginning of the class, I asked you, is marketing an art or a science? And we decided that it was a combination of both. That we can use artistic perspectives, for example, to develop creative strategies for advertising to consumers, but we can also study the consumer as a subject, and so that's the hard scientific part of marketing. So marketing research is enormously important. How do we go about doing this? Use the scientific method. What is the scientific method? Well, it was largely developed according to your textbook in the 17th century, but you can see echoes of the scientific method being developed, for example, by Aristotle. There's almost no discipline on a college campus that doesn't owe some debt to Aristotle. And Aristotle was, his father was a physician. He was a physician by training. And so he studied things in large part using sort of a scientific perspective. How do you do that? You classify things, which Aristotle did, right? He started that. But really in the 17th century, we get the development of the modern scientific method. What is the scientific method? Based on empirical evidence. What is empirical evidence? Well, empirical evidence is testable. We talked about goals in here, right? And I told you all that one of the things, as a younger academic, when I was in my undergraduate career, I was very interested in philosophy and whether or not you could prove or disprove the existence of God. I've gone through all of those. That's not subject to empirical verification, at least not at this point, right? So it's not testable. What is testable? Well, what kinds of products people are going to want, which means that you should also be able to repeat. As academics, when we put our work out there, we have to share the data so that other people can replicate the studies. Now, it turns out one of the criticisms of the scientific method in the social sciences, like marketing, is that we don't engage in a lot of replication studies. Why is that? Replication studies are hard to get published. And so we oftentimes don't engage in replication studies to the extent that they do in other disciplines, and that is one of the criticisms. It's not that we are incapable of doing it, it's that the reward structures oftentimes don't lend themselves in academics to those kinds of replication studies that they do in other disciplines in the hard sciences, right? Particularly in things like medicine, although I would argue that even in those, a lot of times they're not engaging in the most sophisticated replication studies that they should, because drug companies have an enormous amount of money and power and ability to influence the FDA to clear stuff with, in my opinion, less than wonderful replication studies. But we should have something that's testable, repeatable. What does that allow us to do? Well, it allows for empirical falsification. So it's the null awareness of the null hypothesis. Now, Karl Popper says that the only real science is the science of nullification. So how do we engage in that? Well, let's say we go out and we observe something very basic like cows eat grass. So we start out with a theory, all cows eat grass, right? And so we're going to look at every cow, and if we come across one that won't eat grass, well, then we falsified the hypothesis, which is that all cows eat grass. Most cows, we can refine it and say most cows eat grass. I'm relatively certain, having grown up on a cattle ranch, I use this example, all cows will eat grass. Right? I guess that's kind of how you define grass, but they'll all eat grass. They'll eat other stuff too. So the scientific method. So we start with observation. The observations lead us to interesting questions that allow us to develop hypotheses, look at the natural world. We see these animals out there on the plain that are eating grass, cows. So we formulate a hypothesis, all cows are going to eat grass. We can develop testable predictions. If my hypothesis is correct, I expect to find that no matter what kind of cow we have, they're all going to eat cattle. And there's like lots of different types of cattle. My family raises Black Angus on our cattle ranch. There are other kinds of cattle out there, right? Anybody know some other breeds of cattle besides Angus?
Red Angus,
There's
Shorthorn.
Rang Angus. There's what?
Shorthorn, Longhorn.
Yeah, there's Longhorn cattle. And all of these cows are, they're all of the bovine, but they're different. Longhorns are different than other cattle, in that they have this long horn, right? So we've got lots of different, so we should expect that all of them are going to eat grass, right? So we're gonna develop testable predictions. So we're gonna go out, we're gonna look at these cattle, we're gonna gather the data. How do we do that? Well, we go and we look at cows, see what they're eating, right? And we test. Give them grass, see if they'll eat the grass. From that, we can develop theories if we find that they're supported. If they're not supported, we can refine, reject, or alter the hypothesis. So if we go out there and we look at thousands of cows, a random sample of, let's say, 1,000 cows, and we find one that just won't eat grass, all it will eat is, I don't know, corn, which is really bad for them, by the way. We can alter that, like most cattle will eat grass. And then, of course, that will lead to more observations and things like that. So the cycle continues, right? In terms of the scientific method, it's constantly being refined. We're developing theories, testing those, and it goes on and on and on, right? So in marketing research is the process of defining a marketing problem or opportunity and systematically collecting and analyzing information and making recommendations for actions that we can take with regard to the research that we are performing. So there are a number of challenges to doing market research. And these challenges are not necessarily unique to marketing, but in some respects, social sciences are more difficult. Now, there is one of the things that is a common phrase heard among people when we talk about things like marketing and the academic discipline of marketing or management or finance or psychology or sociology. People will say, and they disparage the social sciences, they'll say, well, it's not rocket science. You'll hear people say this all the time. It's not rocket science, implying that rocket science is really, really hard. I would argue that rocket science is really, really easy compared to marketing or management or finance. Why is that? Rocket science largely operates, not largely, it does, it operates within the constraints of physics. If we want to send a rocket into orbit, we know how to do that based on very precise mathematical calculations and a limited number of variables. We do this with great precision because it operates with very constrained environmental variables, right? Largely, that is a product of gravity. And so we send stuff into orbit all the time. What is it that allows this device that you all have to give you, like, again, if we went back in time, when I was a kid growing up, if you wanted to travel across country, what would you do? You would get out this physical object called a map, and you would plan. When we would take road trips across country, we would plan. My mother would get out the map or an atlas, Rand McNally, had these books, travel guides with roadmaps in them, and you would plan like how you were. Does anybody do that now? I can remember about 15 years ago, we were traveling back and forth between New York to see my brother. He lived in New York. And my mother was always like, she's like, like wanting to stop, and she'd want to get like this. They use maps, and she'd want to stop at every state line and like get a map. And I'm like, Mom, like we got a phone. This device tells you where we're gonna go. And so we decided we were gonna see Monticello, which is Thomas Jefferson's home. And at that point in time, GPS, the satellites weren't as great as they were today. And so we're getting halfway there, and the phone like loses signal, and it can't tell us how to get there. And she's like, how's that phone working out for you? If you had a map, you'd be able to figure this out. When I started flying, we had these things called sectionals, and you would look at the sectional. You'd actually like plot a course across the sectional and look at the sectional and use this physical device, right? Well, we now have like this device that does this for us and allows us to do a lot of things, and rocket science is one of these, and it's very predictable. The problem is when you start studying humans, the number of variations and variability and the number of variables that you have to consider becomes exponentially more difficult. Unlike figuring out whether or not we can send the satellite into orbit to get a GPS signal, which operates again within very confined constraints, we now have to consider a whole host of things, some of which are enormously difficult to evaluate. Like beyond just culture and past practice, it's personal tastes and preferences that we have to think about in doing market research. So it's enormously difficult to do. And part of the problem that we have is we have problems with the question of knowledge, which I talked about at the beginning. What is it we can know, and how can we know it? A lot of what we've done in terms of marketing research has been based on survey research. And so I've given you this before, this example, when we talked about the question of knowledge, rigidly codifying an ethical position. And this is a question from an instrument that I used. Rigidly codifying an ethical position that prevents certain types of actions can stand in the way of better human relations and adjustment. So if we're using something like this is like a double-barreled question, right? So it's a question that's like we think we know what we're asking, and it becomes really difficult. Whereas with regard to launching that GPS satellite, we know what the target is, we know what the constraints are, and we can hit that with a high degree of certainty based on very precise mathematical formulas. Whereas this becomes more difficult in marketing research. So it's not rocket science; it's a lot harder. Various people are going to read this, for example, this question on a survey, and they're going to focus on better human relations or maybe adjustment. And I talked about this in a previous lecture. Which is it? Human relations is the ability to get along with other people. Adjustment is an internal aspect of your personality, whether or not you are, sort of internally consistent. We also run into a lot of issues of social desirability bias. If we ask people how frequently do you brush your teeth, most people, we've got a formula in the United States that dentists have pushed for a lot of years now, which is 2 by 2, twice a day, 2 minutes each time. And you ask people if they're brushing their teeth, they're going to say, yep, I brush my teeth 2 minutes a day, twice a day, right? Because that's what dentists tell you. Is that what most people do? I don't know. Depends. Like if you have, I've got a mechanical toothbrush that does it, that you push the button and it goes for 2 minutes, right? In fact, it tells you when you need to switch quadrants of your mouth. But does everybody have that? No. Does everybody say that they brush their teeth for 2 minutes a day, twice a day? Most people will. So there's social desirability bias. There's a disconnection oftentimes between what we desire and what we actually do. And the reasons for that are a multitude of reasons. And so we have lots of factors that we have to consider that you don't have to consider in things like physics that make marketing research really, really difficult. So these are challenges to getting good data. So step one, how are we going to define the problem? Based on observation. This is a lot like when we talked about goals. You have to set your research objectives. They have to be specific. What is it that we're going to evaluate? Well, if we want to launch a new product, for example, whether or not that product will be successful. And you find businesses that will start with maybe doing some market research and they veer off because they're not specific. And I can give you examples of this from my own experience. I had a company for a brief period of time with another colleague. She had her PhD in tourism and hospitality, and we did market research for a number of companies. And I can tell you that one of these companies, we would do this market research, and the CEO of that company would say, you know what I think? Like, I think we ought to have a margarita cherry slush. Like, we didn't test that, right? Because it would pop into his head, and he would think that that's what we should do. And we're like, that wasn't part of the test. It's like, well, could you tell me what? No, because like we didn't test for that, right? So you have to have specific objectives that are measurable. There are 3 types of research that we can conduct. Exploratory, which is often where we start. What is the need in the market? What do we see as a trend? So I talked about in globalization a minute ago, Coca-Cola. What do you think the trend is in the United States with regard to the consumption of Coca-Cola? What do you all think the trend is with regard to the consumption of Coca-Cola?
It's better than other like Coke products, maybe.
You think the consumption is that it's increasing or decreasing with regard to it's what?
Constantly increasing.
You think it's increasing?
Decreasing.
I'm gonna give you a duck. But I think like let's look at Coca-Cola's product line. In the United States, what was the first product we sent to communist China?
Coke.
Coca-Cola, right?
I like to change my answer. I think it's evening out, actually.
I don't think that's the right answer either. Oh, look, we've got Jimmy Carter. Coca-Cola's honoring. What was the first product we sent to communist China from Coca-Cola? Or what was the first from the United States? Coca-Cola. And there he is on Coca-Cola's website. The brands that Coca-Cola has. Here are some of the brands. What do we see? Like, well, Dasani, Powerade, Smart Water. What are more and more people in the United States consuming? If you went back in time when I was a kid, like, and my mother was a Coca-Cola fanatic. She loved Diet Coke. She probably drank 10 of them a day. Is that even Diet Coke? Is that healthy? No. And my mother insisted that Diet Coke was like water. I'm like, it's not like water. What's increasing in the United States? What are people drinking? I never thought as a kid, I would see the day when we would pay more for a gallon of water than we would pay for a gallon of gas. But I can guarantee you pay more for a gallon of water now because you're drinking, like the little pint-sized bottles of water. Those are expensive, 3 or 4 of them. If you buy those, or even a liter of water, you're paying more for water than a gallon of gas. That consumption is up. The consumption in the United States of Coca-Cola, which is why Coca-Cola has all of these different brands. Because the consumption of that product in the United States is decreasing as a result of awareness of how bad that product is for you. If you're drinking fully leaded Coca-Cola, how much sugar are you consuming? An enormous amount. What should you be consuming, as a standard diet in the United States? Well, even this is debatable, but let's say 2,000 calories a day. If you have a Coke in a can, how many calories are you consuming?
20.
Quite a few. And most people get a large size Coke, right? And so you can consume, if you're looking to diet, what they say is a snack, what you should, if it's 400 calories or more, it's a meal. You can easily consume in a Route 44 size vanilla Coke 400 calories, right? So I think it's decreasing. I think Coca-Cola is decreasing. Why? Because it's not necessarily good for you. So going back to marketing research, we're going to observe, exploratory research tells us, what should Coca-Cola is still, for years and years and years, Coca-Cola was the #1 most recognizable brand worldwide. For most of my life. I think that has changed slightly, and it was the #1, if you were going to sell the brand, the valuation of the brand was the #1 valued brand in the world was Coca-Cola. I don't know that that's still true today, right? So why is that not true? Well, we can look at consumption patterns. We're becoming much more interested in health in this country. And as a result of that, we're consuming less Coca-Cola, even less Diet Coke. One of the things that they've started doing some research on is the impact, for example, so my mother drank, she when she was younger, she was very thin, she was a model, she drank a lot of Coke because she hated water, she just absolutely hated water. Then when, she started having, in middle life, people start watching their weight more. When you're young, you can consume everything you want and get away with it. She switched to Diet Coke. One of the things that they found as a result of some research is that even Diet Coke has an impact on your blood glucose level, similar to actually drinking Coke. Why is that? Because when you drink something sweet like Diet Coke, your brain thinks that it's drinking sugar, and it starts telling your metabolism that it needs to, expend those calories. So what is an exploratory study? Well, what is it that people want instead, for example, instead of Coke? What's going to become popular? As the health craze in the United States has taken over, more and more people are switching to bottled water, which is why Coca-Cola has all these brands of bottled water. I'm out of time. Let me mark that. If you got ducks, come see me. Stop the video.